They lied about the stone, the nose. They don't want you to see. The nose is missing. You stand in a dim museum hall. The air is cold, controlled, quiet. In front of you, a colossal Egyptian statue rises out of the dark, floodlit from below. Every line of the jaw and brow carved with impossible precision. The hieroglyphs along the shoulders are still razor sharp. Each feather, each reed, each serpent etched as if the chisel left yesterday. And yet, the nose is gone. Not worn, not softened, smashed, clean. This land produced artisans who could cut granite like butter, who could align pyramids with the stars, who could make stone eyelids look like they were about to blink. And you were expected to believe that the one part that just happened to fall off over and over again across thousands of statues was the center of the face. That is the first truth most people miss. They told you it was erosion, time, accidents. But the stone tells another story. Archaeologists have traced the scars, chisel bites at the bridge, hammer blows at the nostrils, fractures that radiate exactly where a human hand would strike if it wanted to unface a face. In protected temple interiors, noses survive. Outside, on politically charged figures, the damage is targeted, surgical, obsessed. The missing noses are not random casualties of weather. They are evidence of a long, intentional war against faces, against identities, against the memory of who these people really were. There were priests who ordered it. There were kings who demanded it. There were foreign invaders who continued it. There were colonial collectors who stood over crates of broken heads and turned that violence into a story about inferiority. Because in ancient Kemet, a statue was not just a decoration. It was a body, a vessel, a place where breath could return. To cut the nose and mouth was to cut the breath, to silence the voice, to stop the ka, the life force, from feeding on offerings. This is not a broken rock. This is a ritual killing, a suffocation meant to echo across millennia. You need to hear this clearly. When you look at that shattered profile, you are looking at a spiritual assassination and a political execution at the same time. Enemies of the throne, heretic pharaohs, but forbidden queens like Hatshepsut, rebels whose names were chiseled out after them. First, their images were attacked, especially the face. Then, their stories were rewritten. Then, their people were told to forget. And centuries later, when Rome and then the empires that inherited Rome's hunger came to this land, they met those already wounded faces and added their own layer of erasure. European expeditions hauled away statues with noses missing and used them as proof that these civilizations were other, that these faces could not resemble you, that this land's greatness was ancient and dead, not living and continuous. By the time you finish this, you will feel it. Not just know it, feel it in your chest, because this is not a history lesson. This is a reckoning. Once you understand why the nose was the first target, how it connects spiritual technology, political revenge, colonial racism, and a modern campaign to convince you these people were not your reflection, you will never walk through a museum the same way again. You will never scroll past the meme of a broken pharaoh and laugh it off. You will not look at your own face in the mirror as something separate from theirs. Let us go back into the temples where the noses are still intact, into the tombs where the color on the skin remains, into the records where the orders to mutilate were written, because the pattern is there in plain sight. And once you see it, you will not be able to unsee it. This is not about broken statues. It's about broken memory. Because the pattern is there in plain sight. And once you see it, you will not be able to unsee it. You need to understand this before we go any further. This is not a video about broken noses. This is a video about broken memory, about who gets to own the past, who gets to define beauty, who gets to decide which faces are allowed to survive intact in this world and which ones are sentenced to be laughed at as ruins. Most people meet Egyptian statues through memes. The joke about Egyptian statues always losing their noses floats across your feed, a quick punchline, a shrug, the eye roll at ancient craftsmanship. This land becomes a meme. A civilization that mapped the stars and measured eternity gets reduced to a running gag about clumsy sculptors and bad stone. That is the first truth most people miss, because when you zoom in, the stone is not clumsy. The hieroglyphs beside the broken nose are still razor sharp. The delicate lines of the eyelids, the carved weave of the wig, the fine ridges of the ear remain. And then, right at the bridge of the nose, you see it. Chisel marks, impact scars, the geometry of a blow aimed with precision. They told you it was erosion, but the stone tells you it was an attack. Let us go back into the mind of the people who carved these faces. For ancient Egyptians, the statue was not decoration. It was a body, a container, a vessel for the Ka, the life force, a second body where the spirit could breathe, receive offerings, continue existing. To feed the statue was to feed the person. To speak its name before the stone was to keep that person alive in history. So what does it mean to strike off the nose? In a world where breath is life, where the nostrils are the doorway for the soul's air, to cut off the nose is to cut off the breath. It is not random damage. It is spiritual violence. It is execution in stone. There were priests who ordered enemy images mutilated so their power would die. There were rival kings who chiseled out faces and names to erase predecessors from history. There were conquerors from abroad, from powers like Rome, who entered temples and shattered features as a declaration that their gods now ruled. And centuries later, there were European collectors who carried already wounded faces into museums, then pointed at the missing noses as proof that these people could not have been who the statues say they were. This is not a history lesson. This is a reckoning with how power rewrites reality, how you have been trained to scroll past the scars of that violence and smirk, to see absence and not ask you who swung the hammer. Because as we peel back each layer, from ancient priests to Roman governors, from medieval iconoclasts to Carthage burning empires, from race-obsessed scholars to modern glass cases, the missing noses will start to speak. And by the time you finish this, you will feel it, not just know it. Feel it in your chest when you realize what those shattered faces have been trying to tell you about this land, about beauty, about who is allowed to be whole. The comfortable myth, time did it, and other convenient stories. So when you stand in front of those shattered faces and someone shrugs and says, relax, stone erodes, noses stick out, of course they broke off. Understand what you're being offered. A lullaby, a neutral, scientific sounding story that lets you walk away without questions, without discomfort, without having to face the power buried in that damage. This land was never gentle to stone. There is wind, there is sand, there is time. That is the first truth most people miss. Erosion is real, but it is not random. Erosion softens edges, rounds corners, wears everything down slowly, evenly, like a long breath over centuries. It does not aim. It does not select. It does not choose the nose, the mouth, the eyes, and leave the crown, the ears, the carved feathers still razor sharp. Archaeologists, the ones who actually kneel in the dust and read stone like a document, will tell you what they see. They see clean chisel scars running across the bridge of a nose. They see directional hammer blows that travel from one side of the face to the other, stopping exactly where the mouth once was. They see the gouged out eyes of a pharaoh, while the delicate hieroglyphs half an inch away remain crisp, every tiny line still singing its name into the world. There are statues of Hatshepsut where the face is savage, the nose and mouth hacked away, but the cobra on her brow, the folds of her royal headdress, the fine inscriptions praising her greatness, all survive in exquisite detail. There are images of Akhenaten whose names are chiseled out, whose features are struck, while the stone lotus in his hand is untouched. There are temple guardians whose bodies, thrones, and crowns stand whole, but their noses, the symbol of breath, of life, of recognition, are violently erased. If this were only time and weather, why this obsession with the front of the face? Why do entire bodies remain? Shoulders broad, arms folded, feet planted, while the very point where you would meet their gaze is what disappears again and again? You need to sit with that question. Not just know it, feel it in your chest, because this is not a history lesson. This is a reckoning. Look at the patterns. Statues in deep temple interiors, shielded from wind and sand, often keep their features. Those exposed in courtyards, on processional routes, at political or religious flashpoints show targeted wounds, noses, mouths, eyes, the very channels the ancient Egyptians believed the spirit could use to breathe, to speak, to see. And here's the quiet violence. The myth that time did it survives because it is comfortable. It asks nothing of you. It protects a story in which Egyptians are distant, vague, faceless, safely removed from the people of this land today. It keeps you from asking who ordered those blows, who continued them, who later used those broken faces to argue that these civilizations were not truly African. Let us go back then, not to the sandstorm, but to the hand holding the chisel. Because once you see whose hand it is and whose fear it serves, you will never look at a missing nose the same way again. Before the break, how Egypt saw stone, spirit, and the human face. To understand that hand with the chisel, you need to understand what it was striking. Because to you, a statue is a replica. To them, it was a body that could breathe, eat, hear, and act long after the flesh was gone. In Kemet, in this land along the Nile, a carved image was not decoration. It was a vessel. The Egyptians believed the person was not a single, simple soul, but a constellation. The Ka, the life force that needed food and drink. The Ba, the roaming personality that could move between worlds. The Ak, the transfigured spirit. Stone was not dead to them. Stone was a stable address, a place where the Ka and Ba could return, receive offerings, and remain present in this world. That is the first truth most people miss. They look at a statue and see art. The Egyptians looked at a statue and saw a contract. If the rituals were done, if the name was spoken, the image would live. It would stand in a temple or a tomb and quietly demand, feed me, remember me, obey me. At the heart of that contract was the face, the nose, the mouth. These were not random features, they were gateways. There was a ritual they called the opening of the mouth. Priests would touch the lips, the nose, the eyes of a statue or a mummy with special tools, reciting words that were as precise as the chisel marks on the stone. With that act, the image could breathe. It could speak. It could receive the smell of incense, the taste of beer and bread, the breath of prayers rising from the living. Breath was life. Speech was power. To open the mouth was to reconnect the dead to the circulation of offerings, to the flow of memory. The nose drew in the invisible world. The mouth sent words and blessings back out. These were spiritual arteries. Block them, and you did not just damage a face. You cut off a soul. So the sculptors worked with a seriousness most people today cannot imagine. They carved eyelids with tenderness because those eyes would see. They defined nostrils sharply because those nostrils would breathe. They shaped lips with discipline because those lips would speak legal formulas, receive oaths, drink in the smoke of sacrifice for centuries. This was not aesthetics alone. This was engineering for eternity. And it was not only spiritual, it was legal, it was political. A king's statue was his body in many places at once. There were statues in distant temples, on borders, in conquered cities. Wherever his image stood, his presence stood. That stone body could receive tribute, hear petitions, claim territory. It could stare down enemies when the king was far away. It could go on ruling when the king was dust. There were people in this land who understood that an image could sign without a hand, speak without a tongue, rule without a heartbeat. This is not a history lesson. This is a reckoning. Because once you accept that a statue was a living, legal, spiritual proxy, you start to feel the violence in a single blow to the nose. Breaking that nose was not vandalism. It was suffocation. It was deposition. It was assassination, trial, and execution carved into stone, all in one strike. And the people who ordered those strikes knew exactly what they were doing. By the time you finish this, you will feel it. Not just know it. Feel it in your chest. Because the next time you walk past a broken Egyptian face in a museum, you will not just see damage. You will see a crime scene. And we are about to follow the evidence. The first nose breakers, ancient Egyptians versus their own kings. Let us go back. Before Rome, before Napoleon, before museum glass and tour guides with rehearsed lines, the first people to go to war against Egyptian faces were not outsiders at all. They were Egyptians, turning their own sacred images into battlefields. In this land, erasing a face was not vandalism. It was a sentence. The Egyptians had their own form of damnatio memoriae long before Latin had a name for it. Destroy the image, erase the name, silence the voice carved in stone. And you did more than insult someone's memory. You attacked their power in this world and their chance at life in the next. That is the first truth most people miss. These statues were not decorations. They were bodies for the spirit. You cut the nose, you cut the breath, you gouge the mouth, you steal the voice. You see it clearly when you look at Hatshepsut, a woman who put on the full regalia of kingship, false beard, royal titles, commanding a Roman empire that traded with punt and raised obelisks that still scraped the sky. After her death, the campaign against her was cold, systematic, relentless. Her statues were dragged out, faces smashed in with hammers, noses and mouths obliterated, royal names chiseled out of cartouches. Some images were buried in pits, others were broken and reused as building blocks in later walls, as if her very body could be recycled, but her memory had to die. This was not Rome. This was not Greece. This was her own successor saying, "You will not stand among the kings. You will not breathe in stone." Then came Akhenaten and the Amarna Revolution, an earthquake in belief. He closed temples, elevated the Aten, reshaped art so that royal bodies were elongated, intimate, almost too human. For a moment, it looked like an entirely new world. And when he died, that world was hunted down. His images and those of his family were attacked with the same ruthless precision. Noses sliced away, mouths hacked, eyes damaged, names carved out of walls, so the sun disk that once blessed him would no longer recognize him. There were temples where lines of figures march across the stone, and only the Amarna heretic is mutilated, while the others remain pristine. Someone stood there, chose a face, and cut off his future. You need to see how deliberate this was. There are reliefs where priests, gods, and kings stand side by side. One face is shredded, the next is untouched. The hieroglyphs around them still razor sharp after 3,000 years. This is not random collapse. This is targeted erasure, a theology of assassination carried out with chisels. So the story of the missing noses does not begin with foreigners who did not understand this land. It begins with internal wars over power, over belief, over who deserved to live forever in stone. This is not a history lesson. This is a reckoning. Because later, outsiders would watch, learn this language of erasure, and weaponize it for their own empires, their own lies about who these people were and who they were not. And that is where the damage becomes global. Tools in the stone, reading chisel marks, like crime scene evidence. So when you hear, "Oh, the noses just fell off over time," you need to understand the stone is telling a different story. The damage is not random. It is written with tools, with intention, with blows that still echo if you know how to listen. Archaeologists and then conservators read those echoes the way a forensic team reads a crime scene. They study the angle of each fracture, the way a break runs clean and sharp in one direction, then feathers out where the force died. They look for impact points, for tiny crushed craters at the bridge of a nose where a hammer met granite. They follow parallel chisel lines, shallow, repeated, marching across a face like fingerprints of violence frozen in this land's stone. That is the first truth most people miss. A fresh break has a bright, raw interior, a different color and texture from the outer skin of the statue. Ancient weathering softens edges, rounds corners, blurs detail. But when a nose is sheared off with a tool, the break is abrupt, angular, often undercut from below, so the blow bites upward into the bridge. You can see the direction of the swing. You can feel the hand behind it. Look at statues where the cheeks and forehead are still smooth, still polished, still carrying delicate lines of age. But the bridge of the nose is a battlefield, crushed, chipped, struck again and again in the same spot until the projection is gone. In temple reliefs, you see our faces carved in low stone, and only the parts that reach out toward you, the nose, the lips, sometimes the eyes, are flattened, scraped back with visible tool marks, while the hieroglyphs a finger's width away remain razor sharp. Accident does not behave like that. A fall from a pedestal scatters fractures across shoulders, crowns, limbs. Transport mishaps tear away whole corners. Natural erosion wears everything it touches the way a stone step is worn down by centuries of feet, gradual, even impartial. Ritual or political mutilation is different. It is like a smashed window where only one pane is targeted, struck right where it hurts, while the frame stands untouched around it. Across dynasties, across regions, the same zones are attacked like a ritual code. Nose, then mouth, sometimes eyes and ears. The very gateways Egyptians believe allow breath, speech, sight, and hearing to flow between stone and spirit. To break the nose was to suffocate the image. To gouge the mouth was to silence it. To blind the eyes was to exile it from the world of the living. Let us go back to you, standing in the museum, scrolling on your phone, looking at a broken face you were taught not to question. By the time you finish this, you will feel it. You are not just a spectator, you are an investigator. The next time you see a photo of a statue, zoom in, trace the fracture, search for chisel lines, ask whether the cheeks match the wound. Learn to read the violence written into the stone. Not just know it, feel it in your chest. Because this is not a history lesson. This is a reckoning. And once your eyes adjust, you will start to say who swung the hammer and who taught them where to aim. From temple walls to empire wars. When erasure meets conquest. Once your eyes adjust to the violence on a single statue, you are ready to see the violence that moved across an entire civilization. The chisel does not stay local. It travels. It marches with armies. Let us go back. After Egypt carved its own kings out of stone and sometimes shattered them, other powers arrived, one after another, each one reading those faces, those names, those temples as a language of power. The Assyrians came first, hard and relentless, tearing through the Nile Delta, dragging away obelisks and statues as trophies, proof that their gods had humiliated Egypt's gods. Then the Persians, folding Egypt into a vast empire, stamping their authority onto temple walls, inserting their royal names into sacred spaces that were not built for them. There were Greeks, led by Alexander, who walked into this land and crowned himself pharaoh, not by accident, but by design. His successors, the Ptolemies, did not demolish the old images. They climbed inside them. They reused statues, reinscribed courtyards, recarved faces so that a Greek king could wear an Egyptian body. There were Romans who treated Egypt as a grain supply and spiritual curiosity, hauling obelisks to Rome, uprooting monuments from the Nile, and planting them in imperial plazas to say, without speaking a word, that even the oldest stone now served a new master. Each wave learned the code. They saw that in Egypt, to cut a name from a wall was to erase a life from eternity. That is the first truth most people miss. They imagine conquest as land and gold. But in this land, conquest was also memory. So conquerors did not only seize fields, they seized faces. They added their own cartouches beside older ones, chiseled out rivals, relocated colossal statues from one temple to another so that pilgrims would bow to the same stone, but a different ruler. By the time late antiquity arrived, a new fire was burning. Christian zealots inheriting Roman power, but rejecting Egyptian religion, stormed temples and shrines, not as tourists, but as iconoclasts. To them, the statues were not archives, they were idols. Eyes were gouged, noses smashed, mouths hacked away, so the gods of Egypt could no longer breathe, no longer see, no longer speak. The old practice of defacement became a weapon in a new holy war. You need to understand this. Ancient Egyptians had already written the manual on how to kill a presence in stone. Conquerors just read it. They learned that if you want to dominate a people, you do not only occupy their soil, you amputate their image. You do not only rewrite their history, You mutilate the faces that once told it. And yet, this is where the story turns again. Because after Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, Rome, Arabs, Ottomans, and Europeans, a different conqueror steps onto the scene, one without legions or chariots, armed instead with museum glass, measuring tapes, and racial theories. If everyone before understood the power of a face in stone, what happens when the next empire decides those faces must prove a lie about who this land truly belonged to? The colonial gaze. When Europe discovered Egypt's broken faces, so let us go back, not to the age of pyramids, but to the age of passports, gunboats, and museum crates. The battlefield shifts. The chisel gives way to the measuring tape. The next empire does not conquer this land with spears. It conquers it with sketches, shipping manifests, and Latin labels. At the dawn of the 19th century, Napoleon sails into Egypt with cannons in the hull and scholars on deck. Behind the soldiers comes a small army of draftsmen, linguists, and collectors, racing to capture every temple, every statue, every broken face. Britain watches, France watches. Each power wants to possess the Nile, not just in the desert, but in the imagination of the world. This is how Egyptology is born, as a competition between empires, a duel between Paris and London over who will own the past. Obelisks are uprooted and shipped north. Sarcophagi are pried open under chandelier light. Crates of carved heads cross the Mediterranean like war trophies. By the time you finish this, you will feel it. This is not a neutral curiosity. This is annexation of memory. When these Europeans arrive, the damage is already there. Centuries of internal defacement have done their work. Priests have killed images by smashing noses and mouths. Religious revolutions have hammered away at heretical kings. Wind, sand, and time have chewed at exposed stone. That is the first truth most people miss. The faces were not blank by accident. They were targeted over and over because on this land, a face in stone still held power. But when the colonial gaze meets these wounded statues, it does not ask who struck first and why the face. It asks, what race were they? Early scholars draw meticulous profiles of shattered heads. Yet in those drawings, the absence is exaggerated. The presence is muted. Full lips are thinned. Broad noses are reconstructed into straighter lines. Hair textures are softened. Painted browns and reds on reliefs are washed into marble white on the page. There were photographers who framed the break, not the surviving African contours. There were plaster casts taken of heads where the missing nose became the focal point, a visual excuse for speculation. We cannot be sure what they look like, they say, while hieroglyphs right beside the wound remain razor sharp, while jawlines, lips, and cheekbones still speak clearly of this land. At the same time, in Europe, a darker project is unfolding. Scientific racism rises, skulls are measured, faces are ranked. Civilizations are classified on a ladder, with Europe at the top. Egypt becomes the prize case. These people built monuments older than Rome, older than Carthage, older than the empires that now rule the seas. So the question is twisted. If Egypt is great, how do you detach it from Africa? The broken faces become convenient. A shattered nose is presented as ambiguity, as permission to redraw ancestry. In lecture halls, Egypt is described as Mediterranean, Oriental, anything but fully African. The missing bridge of stone becomes a bridge for fantasy. You need to see how that absence is weaponized. What was once spiritual deactivation becomes racial erasure. This is not a history lesson. This is a reckoning, because the same missing nose that once silenced a rival soul is now turned into a blank space where Europe projects its own reflection. Whiteness is painted into the gap. Civilization is claimed as exclusive property. Museum plaques speak as if this land's greatest glory flowed naturally into Paris and London, as if ownership of the ancient world has passed by right to those who stole its face. And yet, even in their halls, the stone resists. The lips remain, the skin tones cling to sheltered corners. The proportions refuse to lie. The question waiting now is simple. When you stand before those broken faces today, whose story will you let that missing nose tell? Inventing the not quite black Egyptian, race, stone, and denial. Those missing noses did not stay silent. They became evidence. Or rather, they were turned into evidence, drafted into an argument about who was allowed to claim this land and its genius. Let us go back to the 19th and early 20th centuries when Europe was carving up this land on the ground and on the page, in the academies of Paris and Berlin, in London societies and American lecture halls. A new story was being written. Egypt, they said, was not truly African. Egypt was Mediterranean. Egypt was Caucasoid. Egypt was an island of near Europeans washed up on African shores. This land was never one thing. That is the first truth most people miss. But these writers needed it to be one thing, a hierarchy. So they cherry-picked. They lingered on the Greco-Roman period, when Greek and Roman patrons commissioned statues in their own image. They chose frescoes where lighter skin tones appeared on certain elites and ignored darker figures in the same scenes. They pointed to damaged statues with worn, ambiguous features and declared, with great confidence, that these were not black faces, but Mediterranean types. And the broken noses helped them. With the most racially coded part of the face gone, the stone became a blank permission slip in scholarly journals, in museum catalogs, in popular engravings. You see it. Illustrators restoring faces, quietly sketching in straighter, narrower bridges where the chisel had erased the original. The absence became an opening. Into that gap, they inserted their own reflection. There were plaster restorations in Europe where Egyptian heads received new marble noses, carved to match classical Greek ideals, rather than African diversity. There were Nubian statues whose broad, powerful jaws and full lips survived, but whose reconstructed noses suddenly looked at home in Rome instead of along the Nile. In 3 dimensions, for millions of visitors, the face was literally rewritten. By the time you finish this, you will feel it. You are not just looking at broken antiquities. You are looking at edited identities. This is not a history lesson. This is a reckoning about power. Because if Egypt could be claimed as not quite black, then not truly of this land, then its science, its architecture, its spirituality could be pulled north across the sea. Europe could present itself as the rightful heir, the natural successor to pyramids, hieroglyphs, and temple alignments, while black Africans were recast as outsiders to their own continental legacy. The same world that erased Carthage's memory and dismissed the Numidians as footnotes now used stone faces to strip Africa of its oldest crown. So, you need to ask, who benefits when the most African-coded part of the face is missing? When textbooks show smooth, beige, reconstructed profiles, When documentaries glide past rows of statues with noses restored into ambiguity, whose story is being protected? Not just know it, feel it in your chest, because once you see how those faces were softened and whitened for you, the next question becomes unavoidable. What would it mean to restore not the nose, but the truth of who those people were? If it was just time, why do the gods still breathe? So let us go back to that nose. Not the polished, reconstructed nose in the museum brochure, but the absence, the wound. Picture yourself stepping into the inner chamber of a temple. The air is still. No sandstorms here, no howling desert wind. On the walls, the carvings are so fine you can see individual fingernails, the curve of a bracelet, the tiny lines inside a hieroglyphic feather. 3,000 years, and a single strand of a carved necklace is still razor sharp. But then your eyes move up to the faces, and something does not match. One figure's nose is sheared flat, the mouth crushed into a brutal plane of stone. The neighboring figure, carved on the same block, in the same style, under the same roof, still has a perfect profile. Delicate lips, intact nostrils, the breath and the speech still there. This land preserved the jewelry, the inscriptions, the fingernails, but somehow nature only attacked one face in the scene. That is the first truth most people miss. When erosion is blind, it does not take sides. It does not study royal lineages and priestly rivalries. Yet again and again, you see a pattern. Statues in deep niches, protected corners, or quiet tomb chapels. Faces untouched, noses whole, eyes still alive. Then, in the same temple complex, a king's colossal image stands with the nose smashed off, the mouth chipped away, while the cobra on his brow and the pleats of his kilt remain pristine. There were reliefs where a former ruler is carved beside his heir, both framed by the same carved border, both standing on the same ground line. There were gods and goddesses sharing a single scene, hands reaching toward the same offering table. And yet, only one name is chiseled out. Only one face is mutilated. Only one set of nostrils is carefully, surgically removed, while the others breathe on in stone. If wind and sand were the executioners, why did they choose the same features the Egyptians themselves believed carried the breath of life and the power of the spoken word? Why do we keep calling it damage when the marks line up with a chisel, when the break is clean across the bridge of the nose, but leaves the fragile ear untouched? You need to stand in front of those contradictions and let them accuse you. This is not a history lesson. This is a reckoning. By the time you finish this, you will feel it. Not just know it, feel it in your chest. Because once you see that every broken nose is a choice, every intact nose is a choice, the museum stops being neutral. It becomes a map of decisions. Which rulers were silenced, which faces were allowed to keep breathing, which people this world was permitted to remember, and which were carved out of the story by human hands, not blind nature. Leaders, faces on trial, how religion turned statues into enemies. So, when you walk past a headless king or a noseless god, you are not just looking at damage. You are standing in a courtroom, faces on trial, names under cross-examination. And across centuries, different regimes lined up to accuse these images of the same crime, holding too much power over the living. Let us go back. In the late periods of Egypt itself, before Rome, before Carthage ever dreamed of empire, the priests of this land already knew that a carved face was not neutral. A statue was a body. The nose was a breath. The eyes were sight. The mouth was speech. So when a rival dynasty fell, when a heretic pharaoh's memory had to be broken, you did not shatter the whole monument. You went for the face. You sliced the nose to cut the breath. You hammered the eyes to shut the gaze. You chiseled out the name so the soul could not be called. That is the first truth most people miss. Iconoclasm in Egypt did not begin with outsiders. It began with people who believed these images worked, who treated stone as a living interface between this world and the next. Then came new gods riding on old roads, Hellenistic rulers. Greek and Macedonian folded Egyptian deities into their own cults, turning pharaohs into Ptolemies, temples into hybrid houses of Zeus, Ammon, and Isis Aphrodite. Some images were honored, reinscribed, given fresh crowns. Others were quietly sidelined, their faces chipped, their names recut, their power redirected toward foreign kings who wanted the aura of the Nile without bowing to its ancient order. When Christianity surged through this land, the confrontation turned open and fierce. Monks and zealots walked into abandoned sanctuaries with a different commandment ringing in their ears: no graven images. To them, these statues were not relics of a glorious past. They were rivals, living idols. So they carved crosses over hieroglyphs. They gouged out eyes from painted reliefs. They smashed noses from granite faces to blind and silenced the gods they believed still lurked inside the stone. Bodies, columns, ceilings were often left standing like empty shells, while the faces and the written names bore the brunt of the attack. Later, under Islamic rule, the pattern bent but did not break. Official policy varied, but the anxiety around images remained. Some rulers protected the monuments as trophies of conquest or marvels of earlier civilizations. Others ordered targeted defacement of faces in public view, scraping away eyes and mouths while leaving the architecture, the sheer mass of this land's memory, intact. You need to see how precise this violence was. Across Mesopotamia, conquerors mutilated the faces of old kings on stelae. In Mesoamerica, invaders toppled carved gods and beheaded stone rulers. Again and again, it was the face, the name, the gaze that had to be neutralized, not just the rock beneath. By the time Rome fell and new empires rose, Egypt's sacred landscape was already scarred. Crosses over cartouches, empty eye sockets staring from temple walls, noses shorn off in 1,000 small exorcisms. So, when European powers finally arrived with their own obsessions, they did not step into a pristine past. They walked into a hall of previous verdicts, and they chose which scars to amplify, which to ignore, and which to turn into profit. And the way they made that choice, the way they turned old wounds into new stories about race and civilization, is the part of the trial most people never hear. The museum as courtroom. Who gets to display a broken face? So, when you walk into a museum today, you are not entering a neutral space. You are stepping into the latest courtroom in a trial that has been going on for 3,000 years. The statues are the witnesses. The labels are the lawyers. Look at the typical label under a broken Egyptian head: a name, a dynasty, a material, limestone, granodiorite, diorite, a date range, New Kingdom, late period, Ptolemaic, then a quiet phrase: damage over time, erosion, loss of nose and mouth, clinical, bloodless. It tells you what is missing, but not why it was attacked. Not what that wound meant to the people who carved it, prayed before it, feared it. That is the first truth most people miss. The museum does not say, this nose was chiseled off to silence a spirit. It does not say, this mouth was smashed so it could no longer breathe the offerings in the afterlife. It does not tell you that in this land, to mutilate the face was to wage war on the soul. Spiritual assassination becomes surface damage. A verdict is being delivered and it sounds like a shrug. Then there is how the broken faces are displayed. You need to watch the light, a spotlight from above, catching the smooth curve of the cheek, leaving the shattered nose in gentle shadow, a pedestal that lifts the head away from his body, turning a once living image into a floating art object, angled just so you see beauty, you see timeless form, but you do not see a targeted wound in the center of the face. The gallery whispers, masterpiece, mystery, elegance, not conflict, not race, not power. By the time you finish this, you will feel it. How the room teaches you what to see and what to ignore. How the same broken head can be framed as exotic relic, as neutral sculpture, as evidence of a mysterious vanished people whose features are always just a little hard to read, just a little too damaged to place. Some institutions have begun to admit the violence. You might see a line about intentional defacement, iconoclasm, political erasure. The language is technical, antiseptic, drained of heat. It does not say, this was a face someone feared. It does not say, this land produced people whose black features were later turned into a problem for Europe, so the broken nose became useful evidence for a new lie. Most people will never hear that part. Very few museums connect the pattern of missing noses to modern racial narratives, to the way Rome, Carthage, and later empires needed Egypt's image, but not Egypt's blackness. The labels do not ask you to wonder how your own ideas about civilization were built on top of these damaged faces. This is not a history lesson. This is a reckoning. Every gallery of Egyptian heads is a courtroom, and the past is on silent display. The trial is still in session, and the verdict about who these people were is still being quietly decided. One caption, one spotlight, one broken nose at a time. What they were afraid of. The power of a recognizable face. If every gallery is a courtroom, then the face is the witness on the stand. The face is where the verdict lands. This land taught the world that a person is not just a body, but a name, a spirit, a presence that can outlast flesh. In life, you know someone by their face. You recognize your mother, your rival, your ruler in an instant. One glance and you decide they are us, or they are them. One place, one face, one judgment. That is the first truth most people miss when they walk past those broken heads and never ask who exactly had to disappear. For the ancient Egyptians, this was not symbolic poetry. It was law. It was technology. The statue's face was not decoration. It was a docking station for the Ka, the life force that could return, breathe in offerings and exercise will. A complete nose could breathe incense and food. A carved mouth could eat prayers and speak blessings or curses. So if a dethroned king still sat in stone with his nose sharp and his lips unbroken, he still had power. He could still receive loyalty. He could still command the living from the quiet shadows of the temple. That is why rivals went for the face. They did not topple every statue. They did not grind every name off every wall. They aimed at noses and mouths, the channels of breath and speech, the anchors of identity. Break the nose, and you suffocate the Ka. Chip away the mouth, and you silence it for eternity. You need to understand how terrifying that was to a new dynasty trying to erase an old one. Let us go back to the religious revolutions. When Akhenaten's monotheism was overthrown, his images were not politely archived. They were mutilated, eyes gouged, noses smashed, mouths hacked away. For the priests who restored the old gods, a face was a live rival altar, an idol that could compete with the new order. To leave it intact was to let another god, another vision of the world, keep breathing in the same sacred air. Centuries later, when new faiths swept through, the logic stayed. Iconoclasts did not fear stone. They feared presence. A recognizable face could still gather devotion in a village, still pull a quiet crowd in a ruined temple, still whisper that other powers, other names, still walk this land. Then came Rome, then came Europe, then came the colonial scholars with their measuring tapes and their terror of what a clearly African face in Egypt would mean. A broad nose, full lips, tightly curled hair on a royal statue did not fit their hierarchy of races. It threatened their claim that civilization flowed north, that Egypt belonged to them, not to the people they were enslaving and dividing. So the broken nose became convenient. A missing mouth became an alibi. Without a full face, you can project any race you want. In every era, the same features were attacked. The nose that breathes, the mouth that speaks, the profile that says unmistakably, this is someone, not a blank symbol. When the nose is gone, the face floats in ambiguity. When the lips are shattered, the statue cannot answer back when you lie about it. By the time you finish this, you will feel it. Not just know it, feel it in your chest. They were not afraid of stone. They were afraid of recognition, of seeing themselves, their enemies, or the people they wanted to erase, staring back from eternity. Pattern interrupt. Let's walk into a gallery together, so let us break the frame. Step out of the abstract and into a room. You are walking on cold stone. The air changes as you cross the threshold. Cooler, drier, with that faint chemical tang of conservation. Your footsteps echo. Above you, the lights are dim, but the glass cases glow. Each one a small, curated universe pulled out of time. This is not a history lesson. This is a reckoning played out under a museum bulbs. In front of you, a massive royal head rises from its pedestal. The skin is stone, but the presence is heavy, almost physical. The brow is calm, the jaw is set, the lips are soft, deliberate, undeniable. And then there's the absence. Where the nose should be, there's a jagged hollow, a crater that pulls your eye like gravity. You step closer. You do what most people never do. You look at the wound, not just the face. The break is sharp, not melted. The edges are angled, not smoothed away by wind and sand. You can almost see the line where a chisel bit in, where a hammer drove power through stone in one violent moment. This land once carved these faces to house eternity, and someone, centuries later, walked up to that eternity and tried to shut it down. You need to see it that way. You need to feel the act, not just the outcome. That is the first truth most people miss. Now turn your head. In the corner, away from the main path where the tour groups flow, there is another piece. Smaller, less royal. A priest, a scribe, a minor official whose name no longer shakes empires. The label is plain, the light a little weaker, but the face is whole. The nose is there, the bridge, the tip, the delicate curve of the nostrils, all still breathing through stone. The mouth is unbroken, the eyes still cut with that deep almond precision you saw on the kings. You lean in, almost pressing your forehead to the glass. You trace, with your gaze, the tiny tool marks that shape the cheeks, the faint abrasion along the base, the chips at the ears. Time has touched it. Time has not erased it. Why did this one live while the other was attacked? Because it was hidden in a temple shadow. Because its owner was no threat to a new regime. Because when Rome and then Europe came to harvest trophies from this land, this piece did not scream power loudly enough to be feared. Look down at the label. See the language. Damage. Where? Loss of nose. Neat, neutral phrases, as if the stone simply got tired and fell away on its own. No mention of ritual assassination of the spirit. No mention of racial narratives that loved the broken face but feared the intact one. No mention of the long war over who these people were allowed to be. Walk a little further. You pass case after case, head after head, royal after royal, nose after nose erased into anonymity until the pattern is no longer invisible. It is shouting. It is chanting. It is telling you that what you were taught as erosion is also erasure. By the time you finish this, you will feel it. Not just know it. Feel it in your chest. And the next time you enter a gallery in your city or swipe through an online collection from your bed, you will not be a passive consumer. You will be a witness. You will read the scars, follow the chisel lines, question the silence in the labels and the comfort in the word damage. You will remember that these are not just broken statues from a dead past. They are testimonies from this land, interrupted but not silenced, waiting for someone like you to stand in front of them and finally call the violence by its name. Who gets erased? Who gets restored? Selective healing of stone. In that moment, standing in front of a shattered face, your job changes. You're not just looking at what was broken, you're looking at what was chosen to stay broken. Because once a statue enters a museum, the violence does not simply stop. It shifts. It dresses itself up as restoration. Restoration sounds gentle, healing, conserving, protecting. Conservators reattach fallen pieces, filling gaps, cast new fragments in plaster or resin, with sanding and tinting them to blend into ancient stone. They compare one damaged statue to another more complete example, measure proportions, reconstruct noses, lips, crowns, ears, so that the figure can stand before the world looking whole again. That is the first truth most people miss. Wholeness is not discovered. It is decided. And those decisions are not neutral. You need to see that. In many collections, royal faces with politically convenient stories are meticulously rebuilt, their profiles smoothed, their symmetry restored, their missing noses quietly reborn from modern materials. Yet other faces, especially those with tightly curled hair, fuller lips, broader, more African-coded noses, or connections to Nubia and Kush, are left in fragments. Their absence explained away as mysterious damage, their brokenness curated as an aesthetic. There were statues whose noses were reconstructed thinner than the surviving bridge, cheekbones sharpened beyond what the remaining stone supports, jawlines narrowed to fit a European imagination of what civilization should look like. There were queens whose softened features align more with 19th century portrait busts from Rome than with the reliefs carved beside them on temple walls. By the time you finish this, you will feel it. Restoration has been used again and again to pull these faces away from this land and closer to a colonial mirror. This is not a history lesson. This is a reckoning. Because when you walk a few rooms over, you see a different story. Greek Kaoroi, Roman emperors, marble gods with shattered arms and missing legs are not left as anonymous ruins. They're aggressively completed. New noses, new fingers, new drapery swirl around ancient torsos, all sculpted to match a classical ideal that Europe decided was universal. Their whiteness is polished. Their authority is repaired. Meanwhile, Egyptian and Nubian statues are arranged in dim light, then their gaps emphasized, their silence romanticized as enigmatic. One civilization is allowed to be whole. The other is displayed as a wound. One is given a face that fits the story the modern world wants to tell. The other is frozen mid-erasure, as if its true features were never fully knowable. Let us go back to that gallery, to that broken nose, to that label that calls it lost. Ask yourself, who was restored, who was left shattered, and who made that choice? Because in the next room, you will see how far some people were willing to go to make sure the stone itself agreed with their version of history. Modern myths, memes, movies, and the laughing away of violence. In that next room, the violence is still there, but now it is laughing. It is captioned. It is a meme you scroll past at 2 a.m. and double tap without a second thought. Why do Egyptian statues never have noses? Someone writes over a photo of a shattered pharaoh, and the answer is a punchline, not a wound. You have seen those images. The side by side of a perfect marble Greek face and a brown stone king with his nose gone, framed as a quirky fun fact about how ancient people just weren't good at preserving art. You have heard the casual comments. Guess they didn't know how to build. Guess time just hits noses first. No mention of chisels, no mention of orders, no mention of the hands that struck. This is how erasure survives in a world that calls itself modern. It puts on a mask of irony. It hides in reaction videos and TikToks and throwaway jokes until the broken face is no longer a clue, no longer a crime scene, just a running gag in the background noise of your feed. That is the first truth most people miss. Repetition is not neutral. Repetition trains you. In films, in cartoons, in video games, the pattern deepens. When this land is shown on screen, ancient Egypt appears as smooth, glowing, almost plastic, perfect golden masks, airbrushed queens, computer-generated cities where every statue's face is either flawless or generically chipped. A vague, ancient mystery texture with no story attached. The nose is missing, but it is missing from no one in particular. There were movies that turned entire temple halls of shattered faces into atmospheric wallpaper. There were games that let you run past rows of decapitated kings and queens as mere obstacles, as level design. There were cartoons that used a crumbling sphinx nose as a slapstick prop, a joke about clumsiness, never about conquest. The people in stone are reduced to scenery, their injuries to aesthetic. Over time, this constant casual display does something to you. You start to see the damage as inevitable, as natural as sand and wind, as if stone simply chooses to fail at the nose. You stop asking why the hieroglyphs beside the wound are razor sharp. You stop asking why some faces are whole and others are methodically erased. The missing features become like background music, always there, never heard. And when scars become scenery, conquest becomes invisible. When the marks of iconoclasm are folded into the vibe of the ancient world, you stop asking who swung the hammer, who issued the decree, Who needed those lips and noses gone so that later people could look at these civilizations and say, they were not like you. This is not a history lesson. This is a reckoning. You need to feel how deep this goes, because this pattern is bigger than Egypt, bigger than Rome, bigger than Carthage or the Numidians. It is the same pattern that turns broken chains into jewelry, ruined cities into tourist backdrops, whole people suffering into gritty cinematography. By the time you finish this, you'll feel it. The way power survives by making you forget its blows. So the next time you see a broken face on a meme, in a movie, in a game, let it interrupt you. Let it sting. Not just know it, feel it in your chest. Ask, even if no one answers yet, who ordered this? Who benefited? Who is still benefiting from your shrug? Because in the final part of this journey, we will learn how to look back at those shattered profiles and name what was taken and who has the right to restore it. Reading the pattern, which noses go missing and which stay so now, instead of just staring at a broken face, you start to see a pattern. This land is talking to you through absences, through what is missing, through what was taken on purpose. Look at who gets shattered. Pharaohs, high priests, queens who ruled in their own name, gods who threatened other gods. Akhenaten, the heretic king whose revolution terrified the priesthood, has faces hammered out across temples. Hatshepsut, a woman who dared to sit on the throne of the ancient world, has statues with noses and mouths chiseled, not crumbled, as if someone wanted to silence her twice. Rival deities, rival dynasties, rival visions of power. The noses go first. Then look at who is left alone. Anonymous workers carved on tomb walls, decorative lotus columns, animal motifs, and repeating border patterns. The erosion touches them gently, wears them down evenly. No focused violence, no concentrated attack on the bridge of the nose, the curve of the lips, the line of the jaw. That is the first truth most people miss. The stone is not breaking at random. It is being edited. Across time, the waves rise and fall. In the calm centuries, when dynasties are secure and temples are rich, you see more intact faces, more whole profiles watching from the shadows of sanctuaries. Then, a religious upheaval hits, and suddenly the pattern spikes. During Akhenaten's revolution, old gods lose their names and noses. After his fall, his own images are hunted down. During invasions, during civil wars, during priestly counterattacks, the chisels come out again. One period, a god is sacred. The next, that same god's statues are mutilated, their noses sliced to deactivate the spirit. The damage moves with the politics. And then another layer. When Rome, France, Britain, and other empires arrive, they inherit a landscape already scarred. But they do not stop there. You need to look closely at what passed through colonial hands and what did not. Statues that stayed buried in the sand, sealed in tombs, sheltered in inner chambers, often show broad noses, full lips, unapologetically African faces still sharp. Yet in many collections that travel to Europe, those same features are missing, chipped, or restored into thinner, straighter, more European lines. This is not an accident of shipping. This is curation as conquest. Over and over, broad noses are softened, full lips are smoothed. Dark stone is described as Mediterranean rather than African. The world is told that Egypt was an exception, not of this land, not of Alkebulan's people. When you map it all together, ancient priest with a hammer, conquering general with a chisel, colonial curator with a file, you see one continuous gesture, a hand reaching across millennia to decide which faces are allowed to be fully seen, which civilizations are allowed to be fully black, which ancestors are allowed to claim their own power in stone. The missing noses are not random scars. They are coordinates, a map of fear, hatred, and control etched into temples, tombs, and museum glass. Learning to read that map is not a history hobby. This is not a history lesson. This is a reckoning. By the time you finish this, you will feel it. To trace those wounds is to resist them, to refuse the lie that this land and its people were ever faceless. And once you can read that map, the next question becomes unavoidable. What does it mean to restore a face that entire empires worked so hard to erase? This is not about statues. It's about your own face. To restore a face on a statue is one thing. To restore a face in the mirror is another. This is where it stops being about stone and starts being about you. Because that chisel at the nose did not retire in antiquity. It just changed material. It moved from granite to living skin. It moved from temples to television, from tomb walls to Instagram filters and plastic surgery clinics that promise to refine the same features those broken statues were hiding. This land was never faceless. That is the first truth most people miss. Yet for centuries, power has trained you to believe that certain noses, certain lips, certain shades of skin do not belong in the image of beauty or civilization or divinity. You see it when broad noses are mocked as too ethnic, when children are bullied for their hair and their profile, when the ideal face in global media quietly narrows its bridge and thins its lips until it looks more like Rome than like Kush. You need to ask yourself, how many times have you seen your own features carved in marble as the standard, painted in oil as the masterpiece, framed in textbooks as the face of genius? And how many times have you been told, directly or indirectly, that beauty looks like something else, that civilization looks like someone else? Denying Egypt's Africanness, blurring its faces until they could be claimed by anyone, is not an academic mistake. It is a project. It is a long campaign to cut the line that runs from your reflection back to some of the oldest, most advanced civilizations in the world. There were people of this land who engineered pyramids, mapped the stars, performed surgery, calculated floods, and wrote in stone while Rome was still learning its own name. To move Egypt out of Africa in the imagination is to move you away from that inheritance, to keep that throne at arm's length. The missing noses become a metaphor. The breath cut off, the voice silenced. The features shattered until the face is vague enough to be called anything, to be claimed by anyone. What was done to those statues is what was done to Black history in general. Chipped away, mislabeled, displayed without context, praised for its mystery while its origin is denied. This is not a history lesson. This is a reckoning. By the time you finish this, you will feel it, not just know it, feel it in your chest. That learning why those noses are gone is really about breathing your own story back in. It is about looking in the mirror and knowing that your face, your family's faces, belong in the story of human greatness from the very beginning. And once you see your own reflection in that broken stone, another, sharper question rises. If they worked this hard to erase the face, what else did they bury with it? Reclaiming the breath, seeing Egypt and Africa with new eyes. If they worked this hard to erase the face, then you are not just looking at broken stone. You are looking at a strategy, A long campaign to control what this land looks like in the imagination of the world. Because names can be weapons, and so can faces. Rome renamed provinces. Europe renamed continents. And over time, Egypt itself was renamed, re-raced, reframed, pulled away from the rest of Al-Qabulan and floated like an island at the top of a map, as if it were never truly of this land at all. That is the first truth most people miss. You have heard it in quiet suggestions and loud lies. Egypt was Mediterranean. Egypt was Middle Eastern. Egypt was anything but African. The same way the word Africa was stretched from a Roman province near Carthage to swallow a continent, Egypt's image was stretched, bleached, and isolated so that the faces on those walls could be claimed by everyone except the people whose descendants still walk the Nile today. To reclaim Egypt as African is not to close a door. It is to open all of them. Egypt traded with Crete, with the Levant, with Nubia and Kush. There were caravans that crossed deserts, ships that crossed seas, priests who crossed languages. This land was a web, not a box. When you say Egypt is African, you are not denying its ties to the Mediterranean and the Near East. You are restoring the full, tangled network of civilizations that moved together long before colonial borders drew hard lines on soft sand. This is not about painting a golden, perfect past. The pharaohs enslaved, conquered, erased their enemies' names and noses long before Europe arrived. You need to hold that complexity. The goal is not to romanticize, but to refuse erasure. To say clearly that the people who carved those statues were part of a continuum of African civilizations. Nubia, Kush, the Ethiopians the Greeks revered, the Moors who would later carry knowledge back toward Rome, not a strange, isolated miracle that appeared from nowhere. So let us go back, not just through textbooks, but in your mind. Walk past the French scholars arguing over skulls. Walk past the British officers boxing up sarcophagi. Walk past the Roman generals, the Christian iconoclasts, the chisel blows that shattered lips and noses. Keep walking until the torches become oil lamps, until the stone is still fresh with dust. Now you're in the workshop. The sculptor stands before a block of limestone. His hands are dark, steady, trained by fathers and uncles, whose names you will never read. He measures the bridge of the nose with a string. He smooths the curve of the mouth. He carves an eyelid with such care that 3,000 years later, you can still feel the gaze. He is not making an abstract symbol. He is making a person, a presence, a breath in stone. By the time you finish this, you'll feel it. Not just know it, feel it in your chest. Reclaiming the breath of these statues, seeing their faces as African, as specific, as alive, is the first inhale after a long drowning. This is not a history lesson. This is a reckoning, a slow lifting of a continent's head above the water, preparing to speak its true name again. What you do the next time you see a broken face. So what do you do with this breath you just reclaimed? You do not go back to scrolling like nothing happened. You train your eyes. You train your habits. You turn every broken face into a question. The next time you stand in front of an Egyptian statue or swipe past one on your phone, you need to pause. Not for an instant, for a moment. Let us go back to that face. Ask 3 questions. What exactly is damaged? What survived? And what does that pattern tell you about the human hands that touched this stone? Not as admirers, but as enemies. Look closely. If the nose is gone, is the mouth gone too? The eyes, the cartouche with the royal name, or the delicate hieroglyphs on the chest still razor sharp while the bridge of the nose is smashed flat? That is the first truth most people miss. Erosion does not aim. Sand and time do not hate one feature more than another, but a chisel does. A hammer does. Fear does. On your screen, you have more power than emperors had. Zoom in. Follow the fracture line where the nose once rose. Do you see straight cuts, peck pits, a smooth plane where a living ridge should be? Compare one statue to another, one temple wall to another. There were periods when entire dynasties were hacked out. Hatshepsut's serene face shattered. Akhenaten's name chiseled away. The mouths of heretics sliced so they could not breathe in eternity. When you see that same violence echoed across different pieces, you are not just looking at damage. You are looking at policy. Do not let museum glass silence that. Read the labels, but read them with suspicion. When a plaque says, damage due to time, while the break is clean and targeted, ask the docent about deliberate defacement. Ask who ordered these faces cut, in which period, for what purpose. Ask why the label speaks of iconoclasm, but never of race. Never of how these broken noses were later used to say the people of this land were not truly African. Watch how often the spiritual and racial dimensions vanish behind neutral language. And when you hear the casual jokes, the memes about Egyptians and their missing noses, you do not have to become a professor. You just refuse to laugh it off. You say calmly that there was a war on those faces, that chisels followed power, that Rome, France, Britain, and others walked into this land and used those wounds to rewrite history. You share one detail, one example. Plant one seed. Not just know it. Feel it in your chest as you speak. These are small acts, a pause, a question, a quiet correction. But every time someone refuses to treat a broken face as an accident and instead asks why, another thread of the old erasure is cut. One day, enough threads snap, and the whole curtain falls. And when it falls, the true name of this land and of its people will stand in the open again, undeniable. This was never just a history lesson. It was a reckoning. So let us go back one more time to that first image that caught you. A royal face carved in stone, eyes calm, jaw unbroken, inscriptions around it still sharp as if the chisel just left. But the nose is gone, not worn, not faded, gone. By the time you finish this, you will feel it. The absence is not empty. It is loud. We walk through the temples where ancient priests took hammers to mouths and noses, not out of boredom, but out of fear of the spirit that might still breathe through that stone. We watched the war between pharaohs, where one king's name was gouged out and another's face was sliced away, so he could not eat offerings in the afterlife. We stood with Hatshepsut as her statues were lined up and mutilated, so a woman's reign could be rewritten as a mistake. That is the first truth most people miss. The violence began at home as a spiritual and political weapon. Then we followed Conquest, Rome marching in. Later, empires marching through. Napoleon's cannons, British collectors, German expeditions. We saw crates of broken faces shipped north, heads and torsos separated, noses already missing but suddenly convenient for a new story. In lecture halls and museum labels, that damage became erosion, time, wear, even when the chisel marks screamed otherwise. You saw how colonial racial theories looked at those shattered profiles and declared, with a straight face, that these people could not possibly be of this land, that Egypt must be an exception, a borrowed civilization. We stood in the modern museum under the cold light where 1,000 broken noses stare back at the world. We traced how curators framed them as neutral artifacts, as if the war on their faces had ended. We named what was really happening, a slow, quiet agreement, not to talk about spiritual violence, not to talk about race, not to talk about power. You watched how the missing features were used to blur blackness, to detach Egypt from Nubia, from Kush, from the rest of this land and its people. Now you carry the weight of that knowledge. There is grief in it because you see how much was intentionally broken. There is anger because you saw how many lies were stacked on top of those fractures. But there is also a fierce pride because despite every blow, the faces still look back. They are wounded, but not silenced, erased, but not gone. So understand this clearly. The missing noses are not random damage. They are the visible scars of a long war over who is allowed to be fully seen, fully remembered, fully human in the story of civilization. This is not a history lesson. This is a reckoning. You are not just learning dates and dynasties. You are learning to see what most people were trained to overlook. You need to treat this new site as an initiation. Once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. You will notice which statues are whole and which are shattered. You will hear the silence in the labels. You will feel it in your chest when someone shrugs and says, "It's just old." That awareness is a burden because you can no longer relax into the easy lie. But it is also a gift because you are now able to protect what remains. And this is where the story turns from they to we. This is not only about what was done to them centuries ago by empires and collectors and scholars who used broken stone to build their own myths. It is about what we choose to do now that the curtain has slipped. Will we repeat their silence, or will we call the violence by its name? Will we walk past those faces as if they are dead, or will we stand in front of them as if they are witnesses? By the time you finish this, you will feel it. Those statues are not asking for your pity. They are demanding your participation, because the war over who gets to be fully seen is not over. It has only changed its weapons. And if you want to know what those weapons look like today, you need to follow this story one step further. Don't let the stone stay silent. Your role in restoring the face. So now, the question is not what happened to the noses. The question is what you are going to do with what you now know. Because this is not a history lesson. This is a reckoning. You have been trained to walk through museums, to scroll past documentaries, to flip through textbooks, and accept those broken faces as normal, as neutral, as if stone just falls apart that way. That is the first truth most people miss. You have been taught to see damage and call it destiny. You need to unlearn that. You need to look again and ask, who benefits when the oldest black faces in the world are blurred beyond recognition? From this point on, every time you see an Egyptian statue, you are in a decision. You can repeat the old story. It was just erosion. Even when the hieroglyphs beside the wound are still razor sharp. Or you can say out loud that someone chose that break, that someone feared those lips, that nose, that profile breathing on across time. Not just know it, feel it in your chest. Let the pattern of chisel marks, of targeted scars, of carefully erased names sit heavy on your tongue until you cannot describe it as an accident again. But you cannot carry this alone. This land, these civilizations, this memory were attacked in public, so the healing has to be public. Do not treat this as content you watched and move on from. Treat it as a conversation you are now responsible for starting. Share this video or share its core idea with one person who still trusts the textbook more than the stone. Send it to someone who has asked if Egyptians were really African. Sit with a friend, a child, an elder, and say, look at the faces. Look at what they tried to erase. Look at what survived. Then go further. Let us go back, not in fantasy, but in study. Read the work of Egyptologists and historians who center the Nile as part of a black world, not an isolated miracle. Seek out books and articles that trace connections between Kemet, Nubia, Kush, Ethiopia, Carthage, the Moors, the whole arc of this land before Rome renamed it. Follow the scholars, the curators, the organizers who are fighting to decolonize museums, to change school curricula, to return stolen bodies and broken monuments to the people they came from. Add your voice, your signature, your money, your presence to their work. Because if you carry any piece of Africa in your blood, in your language, in your music, in your sense of justice, this story belongs to you, even if your ancestors stood on different shores. If you believe that no people should have their face edited out of history, then this land is calling you too. You have the right to demand the full, unbroken face of history. You have the right to walk to an institution and ask why every nose on every brown statue is missing while the marble emperors stand untouched. So picture this. The camera lingers on one shattered statue, its nose gone, its mouth wounded, its eyes still watching. The room is quiet, but the stone is not. The stone remembers. The scars speak. They testify to chisels in the night, to priests and conquerors and collectors who tried to silence a people by mutilating their image. And now you stand there, refusing to look away. By the time you finish this, you will feel it. When you question, when you share, when you read, when you demand better, you are giving that statue back its nose, its breath, its voice. One conversation at a time, one challenged narrative at a time, you are helping those faces do what they were carved to do from the beginning. Look back at the world and be fully, undeniably seen.